The most common piece of technical advice on the serve is to snap the wrist at contact point in order to get power and spin. Is this the real antidote, or is it actually snake oil? Now, this may be familiar advice to you, and thousands of recreational players are trying it every single day, but analysis of high-speed tennis footage proves that the wrist snap is a myth. In reality, the role of the wrist is passive, and trying to focus on it actually obscures the more important parts that create a sound service motion. When people talk about the alleged snapping motion, they usually describe it in two ways. One is a waving bye-bye motion as we hit the ball, and the second would be a carving of the ball to impart spin or slice. High-speed video shows that neither of these things are an accurate description of what happens to the wrist during the contact point. There is no wrist snap at contact point, and any movement of the wrist happens long after the ball has left the strings. As for the idea of carving around the ball, with the ball on the strings for only 1/250th of a second, it is impossible for the racket head to substantially cover any circumference around the ball during contact points. When I say that the wrist snap is a myth, that does not mean that the wrist doesn't move at all during the swing, but it is in fact a byproduct of much more important factors that we're going to be covering in this video. In order for you to take your serve to the next level, we need to get rid of the idea that the wrist is responsible for generating great amounts of power and spin, and instead, we're going to have the wrist along for the ride. So, no significant wrist action on the serve. How could that be? Now, before you call up your teaching pro for misguiding you for years, just know that it is not their fault. No pro or any human being has ever witnessed the serve contact point, and no one ever will. The event lasts about 4 milliseconds, making it impossible to be captured by the naked eye. So, where does the widespread belief in the wrist snap come from? So, we can't see what's happening before and during contact point, but we do somewhat clearly see what happens a few seconds later when the racket starts to slow down in the follow-through. We can see that the wrist has changed positions, and sometimes very radically, but what we don't see is that this is not happening during contact with the ball. If you watch a lot of high-level serving, either on TV or in real life, it's very easy to conclude that the wrist snaps forward. This is where high-speed video is critical for understanding the actual sequence of events. From this video, we can see that the snap is an illusion, and in fact, it is taking place long after the ball has left the strings out into the follow-through. So, if the wrist snap is not the real secret to the serve, then what is? We're going to be going over the 3 things that you should be concerning yourself with. The first is the position of the racket at the completion of the racket drop, which is a 90-degree angle. From the salute position, or what we call the letter Y, this part is a relaxation, and every single player gets the elbow as low as possible, and before they're ready to drive, the tip of the racket is usually almost pointing down to the ground, and the biggest servers take this to the extreme, and they get it as down as possible. Now, if you're just starting off, you may need to start with a higher elbow, and you may not be able to get all the way down here until you find this level of comfort, right? A lot of people are holding a pizza tray, but that's okay. Something that could help is to know that this move is not a pulling. You don't want to be tight. You want to stay loose to famoose the goose. And your racket drop should be a complete relaxation. And you should feel like your arm is just becoming dead weight and preparing to come along for the ride. The second thing that every good server has is the tricep extension from the racket drop that leads to a straight hand, racket head, and arm towards contact point. If you want to get in this position, you should think about high-fiving Andre the Giant at contact points. This way, you don't have to think about the parts of your hand and your wrist moving independently. Rather, just feel like you're getting your racket head to high-five the ball dead on. And the other things will happen as a byproduct. The third thing is the internal rotation of the hitting arm, or what people refer to as pronation. And you can think of this as your entire arm turning over as a unit, which causes the illusion of a wrist snap at the end of the swing. Now, pronation on the serve has been one of the most lively debates in tennis teaching, causing a lot of people to stress over the hyperpronation at the end of the swing. Is pronation the key to a good serve, or is it also snake oil? In reality, the continuation of the arm is a byproduct of the way the player moves the hand, racket, and arm towards the contact point, and it is a consequence and not a cause. Where does all this leave the wrist, and how can we account for the wrist movement that we do see taking place? Let's look at how the position of the wrist changes throughout the duration of the motion. First, we can see that the wrist is naturally laid back in the racket drop, and then towards contact point, the wrist moves slightly forwards so that the hand, racket, and arm can be aligned at contact points. Now, is this slight forward motion of the wrist evidence of a snap? No, because in high-speed footage, we would see the snap continuing directly after contact point, although this is never the case. Now, an objection to this could be that the contact point is what's stopping the rest of the snap. Now, this is a great question, but it doesn't really make any sense, and I encourage you to try this experiment at home. Toss a ball straight up in front of you and try hitting it with the snapping of the wrist motion and see what happens. The force of the contact point is not nearly enough to stop you from breaking your wrist through to the end of the swing. And we can also notice one other thing. The ball went straight down into the ground, which warrants the question, could this be the main factor behind people missing serves in the net? We can conclude with certainty that the racket head is traveling upwards towards contact point. So players snapping the wrist would be very difficult, and a miscalculation of even 1/1000th of a second would cause the ball to land on the server's own side. So this slight movement of the wrist before contact point is not a snap. It just brings the racket in line with the arm in preparation for the contact. Now, this brings us to the most important part of this lesson. The wrist may not snap, but that does not mean that it should be stiff. You should be loose, and you should not be squeezing the racket or having tension in your arm that is greater than a 3 out of 10. The best of all the rest, you could probably rip the racket out of their hand while they're about to serve. That's how loose you have to feel. The wrist, hand, racket, and arm is along for the ride, and you need to let your bigger muscles do the work, and everything else will take care of itself. The entire arm and racket needs to stay loose to famoose the goose. So don't send your arm on a lone mission because it's not gonna survive. If you like what you learned here, I recommend taking the next step and going into my online course because it takes these concepts and builds on them and shows you a complete system for enjoying tennis for the rest of your life. You can get started by clicking the link down in the description and you can sign up on my website.